The Australian Financial Review.
Welcome to The Fin, Election 2025. I'm Lisa Murray with Phil Coorey, Tom McIlroy and Andrew Tillet.
Well, this is the sweetest victory of all.
It's Tuesday, April 22.
I have always believed in miracles.
Who do you trust to keep the economy strong? Who do you trust to keep interest rates low?
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
The light on the hill.
Set it aflame again. Tonight, the Australian people have voted for change.
Firstly, welcome Phil and Tom to the podcast.
Thanks, Lisa, and welcome back.
Thanks, Lisa.
Tom, it's nice to see you in Canberra. And Phil, it's nice to have you in the studio in Sydney.
Thank you.
We're also going to be hearing from Andrew Tillet as well, but I had to speak to him last night as he's following Anthony Albanese around today. I think he's just been to a press conference that Albanese gave in Melbourne. So as we head towards the vote on May 3, the Fin podcast has been talking every Tuesday with our best Canberra experts, led by political editor Phil Coorey, about the campaign, who won the week, the policy announcements, the triumphs and the gaffes. Phil, we're in the last weeks of this campaign, but it doesn't feel like it. Early voting starts today. The death of Pope Francis has disrupted the campaign. The public holidays have disrupted the campaign. Is it too late for political parties to get their message out?
Oh, it's getting to that stage, Lisa. I mean, this was always going to be a dead week in the campaign, and Labor was quite happy about that. They always thought if they could get ahead going into this week, then there's nothing Peter Dutton could really do this week to grab people's attention. As you said, we had Easter at the start and bookended by the Anzac Day holiday, and the couple of days in between, well, one of them's been pretty much lost because of the death of Pope Francis. So we saw this morning both leaders ceased hostilities for the day, although they will rejoin tonight on the Channel 9 debate, but that's pretty much it for the day. As last I heard, Peter Dutton was getting out of Orange, where he was meant to do something today, back to Sydney looking for a church. And the Prime Minister was sort of cloaking himself in the moment as well. So, but look, it's not too late. The thing is, Lisa, early voting does start today. Both parties sort of the view that most people who vote early know how they're going to vote. You know, the election campaigns, especially the last couple of weeks, about the soft voters and the undecideds. So you're going to see a real blitz of advertising. Anything between 50 and 70% of the coalition ad budget has been saved up now for the run home. But look, you know, it's, as Howard used to say, you can't fatten the pig on market day. And one of the reasons Labor got a lot of their policies out even well before the campaign started was because of that view that you have to start earlier each time. So definitely Dutton has to catch up.
And Tom, are there any figures about how many people will vote early?
Yeah, the Electoral Commission is expecting something about 50% of voters to vote early this time. There's been a huge increase in early voting in the past few electoral cycles. There's about 18 million Australians on the electoral roll. And since about 2004, there's been an increase from less than a quarter voting early, and this time expecting as many as 50%. It's a huge surge in early and postal voting.
And what does that say, that everyone's made up their mind?
I think it says that some people have made up their mind, other people want to get it off their agenda, don't want to pay attention to the politicians for the next 10 days. Technically, you have to have a reason to vote early, some reason that you can't do it on election day, but the rules aren't strongly enforced, and I think it's becoming a kind of lifestyle option for people to do it when they've got some flexibility in the lead up to election day, and that way they don't have to listen to Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton between now and the 3rd of May.
Okay, well, let's move on to some policy announcements. As I mentioned, I spoke to Foreign Affairs and Defence correspondent Andrew Tillet last night, and I asked him about the Coalition's defence policy that they've flagged they'll announce in the next few days. This is what he had to say.
In dollar terms today, we spend about $59 billion on the defence budget each year. So to go from, and that's about 2% of GDP now, so to go to 2.5%, you're talking about $15 billion in today's dollars. It would be a big increase to do that jump in just 1 year. But the Coalition is sort of looking to drag it out over at least 4 years, sometime into the early 2030s. So you're talking maybe, 5-6 years to get to that mark. So it is an amount that probably is not going to make much of a year-by-year difference if you're sort of staggering it out over that sort of period of time. But by the end of it, it will have made a significant increase. And in particular, it'll make a bit of headroom for things like the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarines, which is devouring so much of the defence budget at the expense of the other services, the Army, Air Force and Navy.
And do voters care about this type of announcement, these big numbers?
So this might sound like a pretty big increase, but it really probably doesn't buy you much support in voter land out there. A lot of voters just sort of see these numbers, they rise, probably either glaze over. Defence is not regarded as a vote winner in the same way that things like tax cuts or Medicare is or anything like that. So it might get the approval of, I guess, sort of the geopolitical crowd, but overall, most voters out there in Australia probably won't care too much. It's almost a case of a bit of out of mind, out of sight, I think, when it comes to defence funding.
Dutton does seem to want to make national security a prominent issue in this campaign. He wants to focus on Albanese as a weak leader. Do you think that's having much traction? It's
the sort of thing, Lisa, defence, national security is a traditional coalition strength. In terms of Dutton, he's very much identified with that sort of strand as well, as a hawk on China, as we sort of saw when he was Defence Minister, as a tough on crime sort of Home Affairs Minister. He's very much in his happy place campaigning on these issues, but I don't think it's resonating that well with voters. The issues around cost of living, I think, is still very much at the forefront for people. Certainly, we do live in insecure times, as the politicians are fond of telling us, and you just have to look at with what's happening with Donald Trump and getting very much a sense of a world in flux, let alone with what's happening in Ukraine and the Middle East and China's ambitions here in the Indo-Pacific and globally. But it just doesn't seem to be sort of working for him. I think for a lot of voters at the moment, it's sort of very much just a bit of a more focus on hip pocket issues. And I think Albanese, that's playing to his strengths there as someone seen as a bit more of a leader in tune with the zeitgeist at the moment.
And I just want to ask you about the timing. Maybe the coalition had always planned to have their defence spending announcement come out in the week of Anzac Day, but it does also come in the wake of reports that Russia was trying to get an airbase in Indonesia. Labor's playing this down, but does this type of discussion around Russia's ambitions in the region boost Dutton's case for higher defence spending?
Well, I don't think Russia base in Indonesia was on anyone's bingo card at the start of the campaign 3 weeks ago. It certainly came out of left field, this idea of them wanting a sort of a presence there, particularly, 1,300 kilometres from Darwin. It does sort of reinforce the argument about the perilous times, but also too about the need for Australia to have a greater self-defence. The old cliche of the tyranny of distance, it's no longer able to protect Australia in the way that perhaps was a decade ago. So this focus on threats potentially closer to the Australian mainland, it does strengthen the case for higher defence funding. In terms of the timing, the coalition obviously, Anzac Day forms a bit of a tentpole to build an announcement around defence funding on. The issue they've had, though, is because of all the cost of living type of measures like tax cuts and matching Labor on Medicare, and things like the mortgage interest rate deduction for home buyers and things, it's really eating into how much space there was in the budget to fund defence. So the question will be is in holding back the announcement for effectively, the fourth week of the campaign, will the coalition have to pare back its ambitions in terms of what it wanted to do with defence spending? These increases may not be as big as they'd sort of foreshadowed and what we'd sort of been led to believe a couple of months ago.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Thanks for taking the time.
No worries.
Lisa, the thing that troubles me with this, and this has been going on now for probably since Tony Abbott came into government, we've been under pressure from the Americans to lift our proportion of spending as a percentage of GDP. It's a sort of a rule of thumb, I guess, and I can understand why the US has been of that view because more and more they've had to do the heavy lifting in the region, not so much Australia, but the Japanese, the Koreans and others over the years and the Europeans slacked off. But the problem with just having a target of 2% of GDP to 2.3 or 2.5, whatever it's going to be, I can't think of a department of government that wastes more money than defence, right? And is also the least accountable department of government. We rightfully get into the NDIS because there was so much money being wasted in that scheme and the blowout in the cost. It's going to be as expensive as the defence budget if it's not reined in. Mm-hmm. And the reason we want to fix the NDIS is because it's got to be there to look after significantly disabled people and permanently disabled people, and it's just run off the rails. With defence, there's no scrutiny.
It's like a black box,
and it's almost considered unpatriotic to question it. And there's scores of legendary stories out of defence about ridiculous purchases and money being wasted on helicopters we didn't need, or tanks we didn't need, or chopping and changing halfway through. Look at the submarines. Look at the mess with those, or the money wasted on the French bid and now that the AUKUS bid, and are we going to see something out of that? So you can get in this bit of a He-Man contest on defence, who's spending the most. Well, it shouldn't be about that. It should be about bang for buck like everything else. And that's what troubles me about, who spends the most on defence.
And I guess people understand what a consultation with a doctor might cost, but they have no idea what 4 tanks might cost.
No, and nothing's cheap in defence, and there's so many people hang off it. There's so much money to be made, the defence lobbies and stuff like that. Yes, you have to have a huge defence budget. It is one of your biggest expenses in government, but I'm troubled by, the measuring stick is how much you're spending rather than what you're spending it on, and the subsequent lack or the consequent lack of accountability there is.
Tom, what do you think about the pledge from the Coalition to increase defence spending?
I think it's unsurprising that Peter Dutton himself is interested in meeting a higher target. I think in the current climate with Trump putting a fine focus on these things, it's not surprising at all. I agree with Phil that there's little scrutiny and little quality scrutiny of defence's activities. Can you name a single defence project that's come in on time and on budget? I don't think I can think of one. And it's like foreign affairs, where if there was more partisan debate and more tough conversations about what our objectives are and what the best way to reach those objectives are, we would be better for it. But instead we have a kind of measuring test on these numbers, and the parties that are spending more accuse the other of being weak. I think it's a poor outcome for voters and a poor outcome for the budget.
Now, Tom, I want to ask you about the two leaders, because you've been up close and personal. You've been on the campaign trail, just back from following Anthony Albanese for 2 weeks and then switching over to Peter Dutton for a week. So you're in a good position to compare and contrast. What can you tell us about how they campaign and what the mood's like on the ground?
It's been fascinating watching them up close. You spend quite a lot of time with the leaders when you're in these travelling media bubbles following them around. In the first 2 weeks, even in the first 10 days, Anthony Albanese went to each state and territory at least once. He had a mix of defensive and offensive visits in marginal seats around the country. And it was evident, being with Labor people and seeing him up close, that they were increasingly confident that their strategy for the campaign was paying dividends and that Peter Dutton was struggling to make up ground against Labor. Conversely, it was slightly less well organised on the Dutton side. There was more pressure showing on the faces of his key advisors, and I think they were increasingly aware that the polls hadn't really moved in their direction. If anything, they were going the wrong way for the coalition, and their ability to break out of that narrative seemed to be limited. They couldn't kind of shake that off, although I think Dutton was doing a good job of showing up each day, answering questions, presenting himself as a credible leader. I'm not sure he was winning new voters. I'm not sure he was able to kind of change the narrative in a way that he needs to so close to election day.
So there's no substitute for experience. We remember Anthony Albanese had a pretty bad campaign in 2019, a lot worse than Dutton's having now, I remember, but he's absolutely outperforming this time around. Hasn't really had a bad day. But Dutton, we've seen a reversal there where he's outperformed Albanese for most of the last 3 years in Parliament in terms of setting the agenda and, his victory on The Voice and all these other things. But he's had not a very good campaign, and we've seen the momentum shift in the lead up to it and throughout.
So at this point, I want to bring in a listener question, and this is quite a good one. This one comes from Tom, another Tom, from New South Wales. He asks, why are Australians so obsessed with American politics? How has the Americanisation of political discourse affected Australian political culture? And how can we refocus people's attention on Australian politics?
Okay, well, let me handle that in parts, Lisa. I don't think it's just Australians who are obsessed with American politics. The whole world is, and for good reason.
Particularly now.
Yeah, because Donald Trump is just, what he's doing is not just about America. He's basically waging war on the world in economic terms, and you can't be but involved in it. There's a direct impact. When I first started covering federal politics, Lisa, foreign policy and domestic policy, there used to be a fair separation between them. But the world has shrunk, and it's shrunk significantly in the last 20 years. And it's I'm not just talking American politics, but what China does, the whole, what's going on in the region. It's all intertwined now because our economies are so intertwined with globalisation. If a decision made some part of the world has direct impact on our economy, our jobs here. We saw what the Chinese did to us on trade during the previous government, and now we're seeing it writ large with what Trump's doing. The whole internet culture, has helped shrink the world. You get people in Australia who think we have, the same amendments in our constitution as the US. They get confused. Gun owners and stuff like that start quoting the First or the Second Amendment and things like that. A lot of voters have, not a lot, but some have trouble differentiating between the two systems of politics and how they work differently. They want to know why leaders here can't be more like Trump or less like Trump. We've seen in this campaign, Trump has been the third force. What it's done to Peter Dutton. Peter Dutton was aping the less, controversial elements of Trumpism in the early days of talking about migration and things like that, stuff that's sort of broadly popular with the right. But then we saw that become an overt negative for Dutton when Trump bullied Zelensky in the White House, and suddenly any association with this bloke became poison. And Dutton's been fighting that. I just think it's you can't separate them anymore, but we are still our own beast. We still have our own parliament, our own system of courts and so forth. But one of the worrying things is what we're seeing in America is the erosion of conventions and institutions. So it started in 2020 when he refused to accept the result of the election. America is the greatest democracy, or one of the great democracies of the world. We saw Trump, erode that significantly, a trust in that democracy significantly. Now he's doing the same to the courts and the universities. They say you go after the academics, the journalists, that sort of thing. And we do need to be mindful of that in this country because there's people here want to see the same thing happen here. And democracies are upheld by their conventions, right, and their institutions. You erode those. There's nothing underneath. So I don't think we can really not be interested in what's going on in the US because there are potentially terrifying lessons for what may happen elsewhere if Trump, does what he seems to be doing, gets away with it.
What do you think, Tom? Is that erosion of trust in institutions having an impact here?
I think it is. I think we've seen that since the pandemic, a real scepticism about messaging from governments and the actions of governments, even the authority that they have to control parts of our lives or control institutions. I think the other thing, and it goes back to the reader's question, that the interest in American politics is certainly reflected in our political class here in Canberra. They're all obsessed with the kind of West Wing culture of Washington, D.C. as well. I think the risk is that some politicians will take advantage of the cultural shift that happens under someone like Donald Trump, rolling over the norms the way Phil describes, thumbing his nose at the courts and at the media and at basically anyone who criticises him. Politicians here can follow that and that would be bad for our democracy if they get away with it. I don't think it will reach the same extremes. I doubt we'll see people able to deny election results or incite violent mobs. But at the edges, this kind of rejection of proper scrutiny from the media or criticism from independent stakeholders, that will pay a toll in our politics in time, I believe.
Well, you see the feud between Donald Trump and Jerome Powell, head of the Federal Reserve.
Now he's attacking the Federal Reserve, like his courts, the central bank, all these institutions that are supposed to be, at arm's length from government, and it's dangerous what he's doing, and it has the potential to encourage, people to do the same here. I thought it was really interesting in that regard, and it's completely forgotten now, but on election night in 2022, Scott Morrison probably gave one of his best speeches that he ever gave when he went out of his way to acknowledge the result as being fair and urge everybody. I'd recommend people to go back and read the speech. It was a very good speech. This is a fair result. our system has worked. We've done it peacefully. We can have a transition of government without any dispute or violence. And that was a very pointed reference to what had happened in the US a couple of years ago. And so you do need to be mindful of these things. But at the same time, point to the strengths of our own system and reinforce the strengths of our own system and tell people why they're important.
Yeah, make a clear differentiation. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Phil. We'll be right back after the break to hear about the polls and Phil's starring role in the leaders' debate tonight. Welcome back to the Fin Election 2025. I'm Lisa Murray and I'm talking with political editor Phil Coorey and Canberra Bureau Chief Tom McIlroy about the last weeks of the campaign as early voting starts today. We also heard from Foreign Affairs and Defence correspondent Andrew Tillet about the Coalition's defence policy. Let's move on to the polls and see where the race is up to. Phil, what's happening?
Look, it's still advantage Labor, Lisa, as it was this time last week. All the public polls still have Labor likely to form minority government, but there's an outside chance still they can form majority. I wouldn't rule that out at all. And that's the weight of expectation has swung considerably. Remember, before the election, the bookmakers had ridiculously short odds on the Coalition, and that was based on this public expectation, which I'm still not sure where it came from. But now that's just swung wildly back to Labor, probably with greater reason because it's being sort of backed up by the findings. But, it's still tight. It's still very tight in patches. Both leaders are reasonably unpopular. The Labor the ad campaigns have been overtly negative, and I think what that's succeeded in doing is it hasn't lifted Albanese, it's sort of dragged Dutton down to the same level. So as someone said to me, it's basically going to be 100, more than ever, it's going to be 150 by-elections on Saturday week. But you can tell from the body language, Albanese is still he's more comfortable. The fact he's doing a debate tonight and another one Sunday, I mean, Prime Ministers normally don't like debates because you're a slow-moving target as the incumbent. Usually don't do more than one or two and get them out of the way in the first couple of weeks. The fact he's not afraid to do a couple shows
even when he's in front.
With voting now underway, it's a risky thing, but he's obviously comfortable enough. I noticed he did a podcast on the weekend, the rest is politics. When you're doing those sorts of little luxuries, normally you try and minimise your risk exposure in a campaign. So he's coming across as in a fairly good space. But if you do talk to people in both campaigns, as we've said before, they don't look at the national polls. They don't do those in campaigns. They poll about 30 seats on a constant basis, what they call track. And there are some interesting numbers coming up. But, the Coalition's great hope is Victoria. But, there's some weird things going up in the outer tram belt, what they call outside the tram lines in Melbourne. Seats we don't normally talk about, like Gorton and Holt and Bendigo even, where there's some weird swings coming up there. And this is cost of living, and it's anchor with the Allen government down there. So I think there's still going to be some surprises on election night. I don't think it's over yet, but you'd rather be Albanese than Dutton we're at this stage.
So at this stage, would you say there's any electorates you're particularly watching?
I'm going to watch those ones. I don't know if they'll fall, but I'm hearing, keep an eye on them. Even like Boothby and Sturt in South Australia. Can the Liberals get Boothby back? Can they hold Sturt? Western Australia, Labor's just clinging onto these seats over there that they've never held before. I'm really interested in the Green seats in Brisbane. There's 3 Green seats, Chandler, Mather and Griffith, and then the seats of Ryan and Brisbane. Brisbane's a 3-way contest between Labor, Liberals and the Greens. Can Labor rest, Griffith back off Max, and can the Liberals get Ryan back? There's, as I said, it's a very variegated sort of electorate at the moment. It's really, just because something's working in one part of one state doesn't mean it's working in the other part of that state, let alone across the country. And I know everyone's calling this election boring. I'm finding it anything but. I think it's going to be fascinating on the night.
And Tom, Phil made an interesting point that Anthony Albanese has been a regular feature on a number of different podcasts. Both leaders have embraced podcasts this election. It's a new strategy.
Yeah, following in the footsteps of the United States campaign as well, trying to speak to people with big audiences who probably don't tune into the average political debate every day in the news. Influencers, Olympians, business figures, celebrities with podcasts. I think it shows Albo's increasing confidence. I think earlier in the campaign, Peter Dutton was happy to put himself out there for some of these things a bit more. It's good. You know, people should be able to hear more about the leaders outside of the political fray, learn a bit more about their lives and their priorities and the principles on which they entered public life. It'll be interesting to see if we get more in the last week. I think perhaps that as things become a bit more frenetic on the campaign hustings each day, probably they'll revert back to traditional campaigning in pictures on TV news and in the newspapers the next morning.
More high vis. And Phil, speaking of celebrities, tonight you'll be part of the panel quizzing the two political leaders in their third debate hosted by the Nine Network, which owns the Financial Review. What are you going to ask?
Well, it's a secret, Lisa. Yeah, I'm not allowed to give away. Look, there won't be any huge surprises.
Yeah.
I think, there's not many questions that haven't been asked in this campaign, to be honest. They've all been asked before, but it's just, I'd rather the approach of just sort of toss them something and let them talk. Often they'll tell you something interesting rather than, sort of put to them that they're fiends and brigands. So it's a bit of a sort of structured, a bit more structured than what we've seen so far, because I think the first debate on Sky was questions from the community, swing voters. We saw the ABC one, which was David Spears anchoring the entire thing. Tonight there's three of us plus Ali Langdon, who's the current affairs anchor. She's anchoring it. And then there's Charles Croucher from Channel 9, Deb Knight from 2GB and me. Representing the wild world of print and internet. So, we sort of around the world for sixpence, but it's probably the only thing of interest today in politics because they've cancelled everything else because of the death of Pope Francis. But as I said, the overriding sort of ambition of every leader going into a debate is to walk out no worse than you entered. Right? So, to be honest, it's hard to trip them up or get them to say something silly. I thought last week Dutton, his veil slipped on climate change when he hedged on the science of climate change and stuff like that. So they are risky exercises. And
as you said, Anthony Albanese has the most to lose probably because he's in such a strong position. Why risk? Yeah, well, that's the weird thing.
It's almost prime ministers don't want to do debate. They know they have to.
Yeah.
And they get, the opposition leader says, I'll debate you every day. Well, of course you will because it's a free kick, right? But we've seen this campaign a Prime Minister willing to do more than usual and has been adjudged, I think, the winner of both, or at least the first one, and close tie in the second. And it's often the opposition leader who's announced the winner because it's easier for them. So we'll see what happens tonight. I think I have to make a call on it, which I don't want to do because you'll get belted either way. But it's a bit like the stall gift. I think Albo's got to start 8 metres back. I think Dutton gets a bit of a head start.
And what colour tie do you wear? Not blue or red.
These are the important things, Lisa. I bought a crimson tie, but I'm going to get my colours done in about an hour's time.
Excellent.
By wardrobe. This is a new world for me.
And Tom, what else is coming up over the next week that we should be paying close attention to?
Well, putting aside the fact that Phil's getting his colours done, that's pretty extraordinary. Anzac Day on Friday, the Prime Minister will be in Canberra for the National Anzac Day service at the War Memorial. There'll be a sap in momentum over the long weekend. I think a lot of voters won't want to hear from the politicians. And then I'll be watching early voting, how those figures are tracking. I'll be interested to see where the leaders are going, which seats they think that are still winnable and where their presence will help. And I include some of the teal seats in that. I think Peter Dutton's headed west tonight. It'd be interesting to see if he pops up in Kate Cheney's seat of Curtin. Angus Taylor and Jim Chalmers are going to have another debate in Melbourne next week. And, of course, we'll have set-piece speeches, at least from Anthony Albanese at the National Press Club. I expect Peter Dutton will probably do the same in the last week. So there's still plenty of water to come under the bridge.
I hear Dutton's not doing the Press Club. He won't be doing it. So
interesting.
That tradition is sort of broken now. That Bill Shorten, blame him. In 2019, he gave it a miss and went and did a campaign rally in Sydney instead. So Scott Morrison used that as an excuse not to do it last time, and don't expect Peter Dutton to do the traditional press club.
What's the message? It's that talking to voters are more important than talking to the press club?
Look, you'd have to ask them, but they make the judgment that their time's probably best spent that day hitting 2 or 3 marginal seats, given it's so close to polling day, than talking to us in Canberra. Although you do get a nationally televised speech, it's a pretty good opportunity to get, a lot of people still watch those things, although probably most of them know how they vote, but they make that judgment. If it was in their interest to do it, they'd do it. But I remember Scott Morrison got quite a lot of heat for not doing it last time, but everyone conveniently forgot it was Bill who broke the mould in 2019. So sadly that convention's probably hanging on by a thread, I suspect.
Well, thanks both very much for your time on the podcast. Thanks, Tom, for joining from Canberra.
Thanks a lot, Lisa.
And Phil, every episode we've been asking you to nominate the best quote of the week. What do you have for us today?
Yeah, I usually do a runner-up, but I'll just go straight to it, the winner. And this goes to what we were talking a bit earlier about expectation management. Albanese now trying to claim underdog. He said yesterday, when asked, are you going to win? He said, there is one word I will say. If it is a word, I think it is one word. It's a year, 2019. And he's referring, of course, to 2019, where the polls were pretty much where they are now in favour of Bill Shorten. And we remember what happened on that day. And Albanese wants everyone in the Labor Party just to remember that. And don't, hubris is probably their biggest enemy at the moment, other than Peter Dutton. And we've been here before, as someone said to me last week.
Thanks, Phil.
Welcome.
There's one word that I will say, if it is a word, I think it is one word. It's a year, 2019.
Thank you for joining us for the Finn Election 2025. I'm Lisa Murray with Phil Coorey, Tom McIlroy and Andrew Tillet reporting today. The Finn Election 2025 is produced by Lap Fan and Alex Gow, with thanks to Debbie Harrington. Our theme is by Alex Gow. Lap Fan is head of podcast. Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us, as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you on Thursday when we discuss the US-China trade war. Bye for now.
The Australian Financial Review.